Hello and welcome to Sectors Up Close. I'm Elena Casas. We're focusing today on the European car industry and my guest is Joachim Klement, Head of Strategy at Liberum Capital. Well, European automakers have started the year in a low gear. They hit a one-month low on Friday after Reuters reported the EU plans to toughen up emissions tests for hybrid cars. The plans mean car makers would have to sell more battery-powered cars to meet emissions targets. Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, BMW and Renault all say they met their targets in 2021, bolstered by record electric vehicle sales, but they are selling almost as many plug-in hybrids as they are fully battery-powered cars. Car makers are still recovering their image after the 2015 Dieselgate scandal, when some of them were caught cheating emissions tests. Environmental groups say the current tests give unrealistic results for hybrid cars, which actually use the combustion engine twice as much as test results show. Meanwhile, like car makers worldwide, Europe's big names are also struggling with the shortage of semiconductor chips. Just 9.7 million new vehicles were sold in the European Union in 2021, the lowest number since records began in 1990. The European Car Manufacturers Association blames that not on a lack of customer demand, but on the lack of chips, meaning automakers can't meet demand. So, will European car makers get into a higher gear in 2022? Let's ask Joachim Klement, Head of Strategy at Liberum Capital. Joachim, hi. Let's start then with the electric transition. Are European car makers too slow? Are they dragging behind their US counterparts? And is EU legislation going to push them on this?
I think they are dragging behind one US counterpart, and that's the famous one. Tesla is clearly by far and away the leader in the electric space. But when you compare it to the mass manufacturers like GM and Ford or Stellantis, which is the former Chrysler, I think most European car makers are at least neck and neck, if not ahead of them in terms of investments. Just to give you one number, Ford announced that they will invest some $10 billion over the next 5 to 10 years in electric vehicle production. Renault, together with Nissan, for example, invests $24 billion by 2030. So there's much more investment going on, and they're far ahead in that respect.
What about EU legislation? Are they going to be pushed to move faster than American car makers, or are the regulations fairly toothless?
The regulations are clearly pushing car manufacturers in Europe towards the adoption of electric vehicles and the abolishment of hybrid and plug-in hybrid vehicles. It is also easier in Europe to adopt electric vehicles because distances are shorter than in the US. So I think both these effects combined will lead to a faster adoption of EVs in Europe than in the US.
What about the chip shortage, though? Can these car makers get past their supply chain problems this year?
I mean, this has clearly been the major issue over the last 6 months or so. We now see, based on GPS data of cargo ships, first indications that the supply chains are starting to unclog. The chip shortages will slowly resolve themselves. It's not going to happen overnight. So the next 3 months are still going to be difficult. But as the year progresses and as COVID reduces around the world, we think this chip shortage will resolve itself.
As I was saying there, the sales of new cars in the EU were at their lowest last year for more than 30 years, and in some countries like France since the 1970s. Why aren't Europeans buying new cars, and what can the car makers do about it?
Well, on the one hand, the problem was time to get a new car. Basically, chip shortages and supply chain disruptions made it hard for retailers to stock up the necessary cars. And then on top of that, you have to remember that here in the UK and across Europe, we do have a cost of living crisis thanks to very high inflation. And both of these factors combined led to a little bit of a hesitancy to buy cars at this point in time.
Are there any good bets in this space then, in your view?
I think one of the interesting bets in Europe is Renault. And the reason being that Renault not only decided to invest a large sum together with the Nissan cooperation partners. As I mentioned, $24 billion in electric vehicle production. But we shouldn't forget that historically, Renault has sold more electric cars than any other manufacturer, including Tesla, in Europe until 2019. It's now been overtaken by Tesla, but Renault was historically an EV leader. It has lost that leadership position, but it is now coming back. And Renault, in fact, has increased its market share globally from 4% to 4.2% last year. And it has the necessary credentials to become a large-scale manufacturer of EVs. And let's face it, while it is lovely to drive a Tesla or a Mercedes EV, the mass market is what will drive Renault's profits and revenues, and Renault will be the key player to mass electrify cars across Europe.
Thanks so much for that insight, Joachim Klement, Head of Strategy at Liberum Capital. Well, before I go, let's take a look at some of the top stories making news in this sector. Volvo is to invest $1.1 billion in its manufacturing plant in Gothenburg over the next few years to prepare for production of fully electric cars. It follows last week's announcement of a battery plant to be built jointly with battery maker Northvolt. Volvo says it aims for 50% of its sales to be pure electric cars by the middle of this decade and 100% by 2030. South Korea's antitrust regulator fined Mercedes-Benz $169 million on Monday for false advertising tied to gas emissions of its diesel vehicles. The Korea Fair Trade Commission said Mercedes had tampered with pollution mitigation devices by installing illegal software in its vehicles, enabling them to cheat emissions tests. And Nissan raised its full-year profit outlook this morning as it squeezed out more profit per vehicle, but said access to scarce semiconductors would be the key driver of its future earnings growth. The company has raised its operating profit forecast 17% to 210 billion yen, or $1.82 billion, and it will contribute 124 million euros to Renault Group's bottom line for the fourth quarter of 2021. And that's your roundup of the European auto sector. I'm Elena Casas, and this is Reuters.